Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, an unrehearsed panel discussion of the U.S. government's wars and the racism they inspire. Our program is presented by members and friends of AWARE, a local peace group. AWARE is an acronym for Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carlos DeBrook. AWARE was established 14 years ago after the attacks of 9/11-2001 by citizens of Champaign-Urbana who realized that the U.S. government would use those crimes to justify its already long-standing attempts to exercise military control over the Middle East and its energy resources. The U.S. doesn't need oil from the Mideast, but Mideast gas and oil are needed by America's economic competitors in Europe and Asia. And so control over them gives the U.S. a major advantage over China, Germany, and other countries, and that control benefits only the American 1%, the economic elite. The U.S. wars are not in the news. The presidential candidates are a distraction, while the U.S. government continues to kill people around the world. Interestingly enough, the exception seems to be Donald Trump, who in a Republican debate this week pointed out that the Iraq War was, quote, a huge misstep, and that President George W. Bush lied to get the country into it. Of course, that's true, but we don't expect to hear that from Republican candidates. Quote, Trump even talked about the cost of war and how the trillions we wasted on war could have been used to rebuild our crumbling infrastructure. Former Representative Dennis Kucinich, who introduced articles of impeachment against George Bush over Iraq, said he was heartened to hear what Trump said on Saturday. Trump's words on the Iraq War will certainly enlarge the public space for a more critical inquiry of why we went there, why we stayed, and why even those who voted against the war continued to fund it while saying they opposed it, while only Ron Paul and Walter Jones kept the opposition to the war in the House of Representatives. Hillary Clinton, in addition to her support for the neocons' ongoing wars in the Mideast, is a long-standing advocate of Social Security reform, which means cuts, and the trade pacts that benefit the 1%. Trump pledged not to touch Social Security and has opposed the trade pacts as well as the Iraq War. And he's criticized Obama and Clinton's war on Libya. Perhaps even more important, he's rejected the Obama administration's immensely dangerous provocation of Russia and Obama's in Ukraine, and Obama's encouragement of mass murder in that proxy war. The anti-war movement in the U.S. was crucial to Obama's election both times, in 2008 and 2012, against McCain and against Romney. And Obama betrayed it both times by expanding the wars. Today, the Obama administration continues to bomb and assassinate people around the world and manages largely to distract Americans from what they're doing. Most Americans don't realize that President Obama has attacked 8 countries, 2 more than President Bush, and is today sending U.S. troops into no less than 3/4 of the countries of the world. These are the more than 70,000 special operation forces in the United States military, and they report only to the President's National Security Council. Their operations include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. Meanwhile, the President's continued drone assassinations, the New York Times says he chooses the targets himself, have already killed thousands of people, including U.S. citizens and hundreds of children, and they continue, although the administration doesn't talk about it. In addition to conducting wars throughout the Mideast, the Obama administration is acting with belligerence toward China and promoting the ongoing proxy war against Russia and Ukraine, which has killed more people than Israel killed, with U.S. permission, in Gaza in 2014. President Obama says he's fighting terrorism, the Islamic State, ISIS, and Al-Qaeda. But America's worldwide violence is creating terrorists, not defeating them. Worse, the U.S. is today covertly cooperating with those terrorists, the people who committed 9/11, notably in Syria. The U.S. created modern jihadism, or terrorism, 40 years ago during the Carter administration, when the U.S. collected the most fanatic Islamists it could find, armed them, and sent them into Afghanistan before the Russian invasion of that country, specifically to harass the Russians and, quote, give the Soviets a Vietnam of their own, close quote, as President Carter's national security advisor said. Although control of Mideast energy resources was the real reason, The Bush and Obama administrations launched wars in the Mideast and killed well over 1 million people with a propagandistic excuse that they were fighting terrorism. But what, after all, is that? There are, in fact, official definitions of terrorism in U.S. and British law and in U.S. Army manuals, all about the same. Terrorism is defined as, quote, the calculated use of violence or threat of violence to attain goals that are political, religious, or ideological in nature through intimidation, coercion, or instilling fear, close quote. In other words, the military operations themselves of the Bush and Obama administrations fall under the definition of terrorism. In fact, state-directed international terrorism in the technical sense of U.S. and British law. But when the U.S. government and media refer to terrorism, we all know that they mean terrorism practiced by foreigners against us, not the terrorism, often more extreme, practiced by the U.S. and its clients against others, particularly in the Mideast. So it becomes clear that Noam Chomsky is correct when he says, everyone's worried about stopping terrorism. Well, there's really an easy way. Stop participating in it, close quote. He pointed out that Obama's secret drone program is the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times. 40 years ago, the U.S. government withdrew from an illegal war because Americans demanded it. By 1978, polls showed that 72% of the U.S. population regarded the war in Vietnam not as a mistake, but as fundamentally wrong and immoral. As in Southeast Asia then, so in Southwest Asia today, the U.S. must end its criminal war. We must demand that President Obama and his successor, probably Mrs. Clinton, 1, end the drone assassinations, 2, bring all U.S. troops and weapons home, 3, close the 1,000 foreign U.S. bases around the world. No other country has more than 12. 4, end the provocations of Russia and Ukraine and China in the South China Sea. 5, end support for Israel's apartheid policy and stop sending them money and weapons. And 6, support negotiations among the U.S., Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and the Kurds to end the Syrian and Iraqi civil wars. In a book on the last presidential campaign, President Obama is quoted as follows, "Turns out I'm really good at killing people," Obama said quietly. "Didn't know that was going to be a strong suit of mine." However ironically he meant it, the quote has not been denied by the White House, and it turns out to be true. There's a lot of news about U.S. government war-making this week, but you won't hear much about it in the American media. We'll mention some of it tonight, and we'll start with Ron Zook.
Yes, I want to mention several points, skipping around from continent to continent about American activities and plans for those areas, establishing or reestablishing American dominance and hegemony in those areas. Exclusive, Reuters. U.S. budget plan includes over $13 billion for a new submarine. Maybe I've mentioned this before. The Pentagon's next 5-year budget proposal seeks over $13 billion in funding for a new submarine to carry nuclear ballistic missiles, plus orders for more Boeing and Lockheed Martin fighter jets, according to sources familiar with the plans. The plan also shifts the Navy's strategy for a new carrier-based unmanned drone to focus more on intelligence gathering and refueling than combat strike missions. U.S. Secretary of Defense Ash Carter plans to map out his spending priorities for the $583 billion 2017 defense budget Tuesday, that's last week, ahead of the official budget release. So the latest development here, and the media keeps us up to date on the latest technical advances, the most sophisticated, advanced weapons technology that we have are ever bigger and better and more powerful killing machines around the world. U.S. Navy wants to deploy railgun aboard Zumwalt-class destroyers. There's a new kind of technology now. The United States Navy Admiral is pushing to have a working electromagnetic railgun installed aboard a high-tech warship in order to utilize the energy output of the vessel's built-in power plant. Railguns are armaments that make use of electricity instead of gunpowder to launch a projectile at speeds that are 6 or 7 times faster than sound. This motion allows the projectile to gather enough kinetic energy to destroy its intended target. Indeed, at that speed, 6 or 7 times the speed of sound, even a very small projectile will completely destroy anything in its path. So this goes on to say that officials have been eyeing the Zumwalt-class destroyers as a potential candidate to carry electromagnetic railgun since the warship program was launched. The USS Lyndon B. Johnson, which is scheduled to be finished in 2018, will be the third and final warship in its class. The 600-foot-long destroyers are fitted with marine turbines that resemble those that power the Boeing 777. These turbines are capable of generating as much as 78 megawatts worth of electricity to propel the warship, as well as operate its sensors and weaponry. It is also enough power to fire a railgun. The physical principle involved is that rather than shooting things out of a barrel, cylindrical barrel, as we ordinarily think of in terms of firearms, that the projectile is mounted on a rail and gets successive kicks of very high electrical energy, which propel it off the rail and at its intended target. And at Mach 6 or 7, the thing will penetrate anything and everything that anyone can ever think of, apparently. So marvelous new technological advance as we prepare for the next war. In the Far East, U.S. responses to North Korea nuke and missile tests will upset China. This is Associated Press. North Korea nuclear and rocket tests are drawing quick responses from the U.S. that will upset a supposed partner against Pyongyang's weapons development. New efforts to toughen South Korea's missile defense system and sanctions legislation moving swiftly through the Congress could both hurt Chinese interests. So this has been the position of U.S. diplomacy for some time. We keep heckling China and punishing them for not being more hostile and active, aggressing against North Korea for their attempts to launch a satellite, to try some atomic weapons, and so on. So that can't be tolerated, and the U.S. has been for some time in the position of telling China to go after your ally and punish those people for their weapons development. Still in Asia, as the economy slips, wealthy Chinese move money out. An exodus of capital in which companies and individuals are moving large sums of money out of China for fear of currency devaluation is casting doubt on the nation's economic prospects. So I was hoping Karen Harum would be here. She lived in Asia for a number of years and usually has something very interesting to say about what's going on there. The ancient Silk Road is back in business as a new train connects China to Tehran. The first train connecting Iran and China, loaded with Chinese goods, arrived in Tehran Monday, reviving the ancient Silk Road trade route and highlighting the economic possibilities for Iran since the lifting of international sanctions, the Agence France Presse reports. The 5,900-mile trip from eastern Xinjiang province took 14 days, or 30 days less than a typical sea voyage between Shanghai and the Iranian point of Bandar Abbas, according to the head of the Iranian railway company. So interesting development there. The return trip will have apparently a good many rail cars of oil from Iran to China. And again, a development that the USA will probably view with very great suspicion and apprehension. U.S. Admiral warns Chinese fighter flights from South China Sea runways. Any move by China to fly jet fighters from runways on the new man-made islands in the disputed South China Sea would be destabilizing and would not deter U.S. flights from over the area, a senior U.S. naval officer said on Monday. So we're again issuing warnings, do not try to fly military jets off of those islands. Several commercial passenger jets have already landed apparently on those new runways, 900 meters long apparently. But we're still telling them better not do that because there will be terrible consequences. In Afghanistan, Reuters, February 15th, civilian casualties in Afghanistan hit record high according to the United Nations. Civilian casualties in the war in Afghanistan rose to record levels for the 7th year in a row in 2015, as violence spread across the country in the wake of the withdrawal of most international troops, the United Nations reported on Sunday. At least 3,545 non-combatants died, and another 7,457 were injured by fighting last year in a 4% increase over 2014. The international organization said in its annual report on civilian casualties. The harm done to civilians is totally unacceptable, Nicholas Haystrom, the head of the UN Assistance Mission for Afghanistan, said in a statement. Increasingly desperate fighting between Western-backed governments and the insurgent groups meant more non-combatants are being killed in the crossfire, investigators report, pointing to two developments in particular that pushed casualties up. Heavy fighting in the northern city of Kunduz, which briefly fell to the Taliban in late September, and a wave of suicide bombs which killed and wounded hundreds of people in the capital, Kabul, last year, were the main factors behind the rise. What's currently in the news and setting off a flurry of accusations. Who do we blame? 22 dead, 8 presumed dead after 2 hospitals struck in Syria, sources say. So the blame game is going on now with great fury, each side in the very confused and confusing situation in Syria, blaming the other for carrying out this brutal attack on the hospitals. Of course, Russia was immediately blamed by American and sources and American allies, but there's plenty of reasons to doubt that and reserve judgment at present. It's not clear who did it. Meanwhile, Israel continues to decimate Palestinians, maintaining a favorable kill ratio of about 6 to 1. And so the war of attrition goes on there. We keep hearing that the Jewish state has a right to exist and to defend itself, but we never hear about whether the Islamic State has a right to exist and to defend itself, and the implications of either answer that, or any answer that anyone might give to that question. So I submit that as something that you might contemplate. Does the Islamic State have a right to exist? And does it have a right to defend itself? I'm not interested in your answer, but how you get to it. And this is something that always used to annoy my students when I told them, I don't care whether your answer is yes or no, up or down. I want to know how you get there. What's the reasoning behind it? And that seemed to really frustrate them. But there I'll stop.
Thank you, Ron. You're watching Aware on the Air, and we'll go to Michael Bay.
Yes. More and more people are standing up against Israel's injustices as its occupation in Palestine continues to grow and intensify. Yesterday at around 6 p.m., the University of Illinois Chicago Undergraduate Student Government Assembly voted unanimously to pass a resolution urging the university to divest from corporations profiting off the Israeli occupation and other human rights violations. The resolution aims to end UIC's complicity in investments within multinational corporations that actively profit and enable human rights violations, including G4S, Hewlett-Packard, Caterpillar, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and Foxconn. Within the resolution, USC Divest also emphasized transparency, urging the university to share its investment portfolio with the public and establish a role for students on the Board of Trustees Investment Committee. USC Divest is a student-led movement on campus made up of 24 organizations calling on UIC to divest from all human rights violations. This vote comes after several weeks of campaigning by the UIC Divest Coalition to mobilize the student body, gathering more than 800 signatures in support. In 1987, UIC partially divested from apartheid in South Africa in response to mass pressure from the student body. Thus, UIC has a history of divestment and a long-standing commitment to social justice. The resolution passed tonight is indicative of UIC Divestment's commitment to pressure UIC to uphold its commitment to socially responsible investments. This vote comes after weeks of hard work by UIC students to raise awareness on campus. There were held multiple workshops, actions, events, and table for days in the student center, gathering hundreds of signatures on a petition in order to ensure that students were informed on the issue. We are ecstatic that USG did the right thing in voting unanimously to divest, withstanding pressure from opposition and outside lobbyist organizations. In October 2015, a student at UIC had received a death threat after an organized die-in protest on campus as part of the International Day of Action for Palestine. The message stated, if there is one more demonstration in the quad from your petty organization, consider it to be your real bodies falling next time. What you did was downright anti-Semitism. Don't underestimate the Jewish presence on campus. While tonight's divestment vote is an important step in the divestment movement, there continue to be aggressive counter voices, and we recognize that this is just the beginning. We are committed to working towards urging the university to divest wholly from the Israeli occupation and all forms of oppression of marginalized communities and to uphold the demand of its students.
Thank you very much, Michael. This is extremely important and a very, very interesting development, particularly in the state of Illinois, where those outside lobbyists that you mentioned worked very hard on the Illinois legislature this past year to make sure that the legislature passed a directive that prevented the University of Illinois as a whole to invest in companies that were observing the boycott of Israel's illegal occupation of Palestinian lands. That's very interesting, particularly when the good liberals in the Illinois legislature could not bring themselves to vote against that resolution, and it passed overwhelmingly in the state legislature. And the result was the effectiveness of lobbying by the government of Israel itself through its consulate in Chicago, and it's the Israel lobby that is supporters of the Israeli policies in the United States. So it's extremely important that examples like this occur, student groups calling on the university, in this case the University of Illinois at Chicago, withdraw their funds from companies that profit from the illegal occupation of Palestinian lands. It's a model, and I hope perhaps it'll be imitated at the little university around the corner here, huh?
There is a student group, the Students Justice for Palestine, who are also active at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, but there hasn't been a similar resolution being passed yet.
You're watching Aware on the Air. We've raised a number of topics already. I think we'll go back and talk about some of the things that have been suggested already this evening. Our colleague Karen Arum is not with us, as Ron pointed out, and he raised some important points about China that is normally her area of concern. But she did post for us a comment that strikes me as particularly interesting on these subjects. I'll simply read what we have here. The West is all about reforms in countries it wants to control and exploit. Privatization, unpayable IMF, International Monetary Fund, and World Bank projects to force defaults in order to steal public property at 10 cents on the dollar. Reduce tariffs to destroy local integrated industries and agriculture so the targeted people end up enslaved to mono exports of manufactured goods and commodities, products the West wants to buy on the cheap. This is the general program of neoliberalism and globalization, and the argument in this piece is that China acts differently. That's not the kind of reforms Xi Jinping, the president of China, has in mind. Contrary to Western propaganda, the Chinese people live in a communist society, which means they own the means of production. Thus, there is no private real estate in China, not 1 square millimeter. All of the banks are owned by the people, and China's treasury prints its own money. The entire media and press industry is people-owned. All the phone companies, airlines, railroads, and utilities are people-owned. Every key industrial sector is dominated by people-owned businesses. More and more of them are joining the Fortune 500 biggest corporation list, and they're some of the world's most profitable concerns. China still very astutely and slowly changes tariffs so that Chinese businesses can get established, with many of them, public and private, establishing themselves as national and international champions. This, by the way, is not anything new in world history. It was precisely the tariff structure that allowed American industry and agriculture to develop in the 19th century over against a world economically controlled by the European states. Back to this account of what China is doing today. Since becoming President Xi has come out full force against the West's phony, quote, universal values, human rights, and pluralistic democracy. He and the Chinese Party know that these have been taken and continue to be battering rams to destroy national governments and install stooge leaders who open the floodgates to Western colonialism. One only has to look at places like the Ukraine, Georgia, the former Yugoslavia, Honduras, Guatemala, Hong Kong, and too many others to list to see why the Chinese people are not only fighting for their freedom, but their livelihoods and lives. Xi's administration openly scorns the West's well-worn but sadly successful color revolution playbook, and like Russia and India, has passed strict laws against foreign non-governmental organizations, NGOs. These countries have called this evil for what it is. They are nothing more than fronts for the CIA and related organizations to overthrow countries that have not been incorporated into the American economic orbit. It's very difficult to look at Ukraine and not see the truth of this assertion. This comment, as I say, is provided for us by our colleague Karen Arum, but the importance of the New Silk Road Chinese line that Ron began with this evening seems to me to be underlined by the very real American campaign to try to control Chinese development and indeed to retard the economic development of Eurasia, because the economic development of Eurasia will conflict with the profitable control of the world economy enjoyed right now by the American 1%. It is important, as Ron said, that the train sent from Shanghai to Iran will return with oil. China imports a good bit of the oil for its industrial structure, and the Pentagon has quite openly talked about what it calls offshore control of China, What the Pentagon means by offshore control is a stranglehold on the import of oil by sea into China, which it remains a threat to the Chinese economy. Offshore control is something that all that military hardware that Ron was talking about is in place for. Now, what the New Silk Road does, of course, is make that offshore control much more difficult. And the overland route to West Asia that returns oil to China makes the American geostrategic attempt to control and retard Eurasian economic development all that much more difficult. So an important theme, I think, Ron. Comment on that?
Yes, I think we're seeing a gradual realignment here. Some people are getting the idea in the Eurasian area that they can proceed with economic development and military development without the United States. And this is very deeply threatening to the USA because it's been our view, that is the official agencies of the United States government, not me, to demand control, or at least indirect control, or at least veto power over every military, economic, and political development everywhere around the world. And if we don't have that, then we start subverting other countries, and it's happened again and again, saying that there needs to be a regime change there, and we're going to replace the governors, the top people in those countries. And we see what that's led to again and again in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, and on and on. So I think it's time to rethink the whole idea. Will these countries be allowed to develop independently? Well, I don't really see why not, but this seems to be a very grave concern to American policymakers.
Comments on this, Michael? Okay. You're watching Aware on the Air. We're discussing the war policy of the United States and its effect in the world today. Ron mentioned earlier about the massive number of civilian casualties, deaths, in Afghanistan in this past year. But we need to underline the fact that the President's assertion that the American war in Afghanistan is over is nothing short of a lie. The U.S. still has 10,000 troops in Afghanistan, 10,000 troops under its command, to say nothing of the special forces and drone strikes that occur throughout Afghanistan to this day. Ron mentioned the attack on the Doctors Without Borders hospital in Kunduz, which was carried out by the United States, and the ongoing control of Afghanistan, which the U.S. demands, has been recently reinforced by the reintroduction of American troops into the southern province of Helmand. Now, this is, once again, the remarkable thing about this is that this is all occurring outside political discussion in the United States. The war in Afghanistan, which has gone on for 15 years, people point out it's the longest war that the U.S. has ever conducted, continues. But it's not, for the most part, a matter of our discussion. Ron also mentioned the confused situation in Syria. And the U.S. is doing a great deal to make sure that people remain confused about that. It's quite a dangerous and volatile situation at the moment, in that American allies, American clients, Turkey and Saudi Arabia, are threatening to invade Syria because of the reverses suffered by the jihadist forces, the terrorist forces, the Islamist forces that the U.S. has been supporting in that country. The remarkable fact, once again not part of our public discussion, is that the U.S. is sponsoring essentially the same people that performed the 9/11 attacks in New York and Washington, the same organizations, in order to harass the government in Damascus, the government of Syria, the Assad government, which the United States has determined must go. Russia has entered the conflict in Syria. It's a civil war in Syria prompted by the United States on the side of the opponents of the on the side of the Syrian government at the invitation of the legitimate government of Syria, in order to stymie this insurgency that the U.S. has supported and indeed created, it's that insurgency that's the source of the massive refugee problem that is being visited upon Europe. In other words, the U.S. is at the base of that too. Now, the interesting question this weekend, the interesting and indeed very, very dangerous question this week, is how far the U.S. will go in allowing Turkey and Saudi Arabia to act militarily in Syria, as they are doing right now, in order to counter the gains that the Syrian government and its Russian allies have made in that country. It's an extremely dangerous situation, and for the most part, not discussed in the United States. A shocking business from beginning to end that most Americans are not aware of, even though the death rates are overwhelming, and it's our responsibility.
It has become a sort of proxy war between the USA and Russia, which is extremely dangerous and utterly foolish, it seems to me. But that kind of alignment is taking place there, and it puts me in despair. That's why I keep bringing my little
Your death's head?
death's head, yeah, as a constant grim reminder of the killing, burning, shooting, bleeding, dying that goes on constantly, even as we speak. And what can we do to help decrease that or end it? And it's pretty depressing to me personally. But anyway, Michael, have you heard about these laws that are being passed in some states against abdicating BDS and
Yes.
yeah, and organizing boycotts, just being turned into a criminal matter apparently in some places. At the same time, some of our conservative pundits keep hammering on the supposed leftist attempts to restrict speech. That means that they're trying to impose some kind of regulations, apparently on corporate support of particular candidates and propaganda themes. And the Supreme Court has told us that in Citizens United that's part of their freedom of speech of the corporations and so on. So they can pour unlimited amounts of what's called dark money, source unknown, into these political campaigns. And according to Mr. Will, this is any attempt to restrict that is a assault on freedom of speech carried out by these awful liberals, leftists, and so on. So can we clarify that? I mean, is that a reasonable thing to say?
Well, and then, of course, the campaign against advocating boycotts like the boycotts used against South African apartheid a generation ago, that campaign is not limited to the United States. What's going on in a number of European countries, including the UK, are attempts to do exactly the same thing. The Israel lobby, that is the supporters of the Israel government around the world, have concluded that the way to defend the apartheid government of Israel against the same techniques that were used against the apartheid government of South Africa is to make illegal these sorts of boycotts. I would not have believed that they could have got so far in this country, to say nothing of, well, actually, I would have believed they would have got that far in Europe, but faster than they would have got that far in this country. But it's a very serious business, and quite contrary to the sorts of laws and assumptions that allowed the campaign against South African apartheid to succeed. Any views from?
A big problem seems to be the very strong lobby that even this, when students vote for a particular resolution, it might not even get considered. So this is just a small step into the direction. I'd like to remind of the 6-1 vote that we had for coal divestment here at UIUC campus, and that has that took 2.5 years campaigning until the UIUC administration actually decided to divest from fossil fuels, or at least partially for the publicly disclosed investments that they do. It's a very important thing for both students and for normal citizens to be able to raise their voice against this, and forbidding or prohibiting any such public voice is crucially undermining the right to public.
One is tempted to say un-American, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, patting ourselves on the back with the idea that there are principles here that are being violated, but they are very important principles indeed. And once again, this is rarely, if ever, being reported in the American media. So you hear it here, but not elsewhere.
Carl, what do you have to say about Obama in this case? I would estimate that 95% of the criticism he's getting in the mass media is that his foreign and military policy is that of a softy, a weakling, a pussy, and maybe because of he's secretly a Muslim like his father, and yet your criticism seems to be the opposite. So does he need to show the world that he has a pair or not?
Well, it's interesting, and it shows in some sense the fantasy world of American political discussion when it comes to foreign policy. This isn't new. I mean, the fantasy world in the 1960s allowed the Vietnam War to continue as long as it did. I mean, Americans understood that our president was vigorously opposing the worldwide outreach of communism, the international communist conspiracy, as John Kennedy said, that was gobbling up countries around the world unless brave men from the United States stand up to this massive explosion of Soviet imperialism. I mean, that went on for years, you know, and it supported what American governments knew they were doing perfectly well. American administrations, the Kennedy and Johnson administrations knew perfectly well they were doing, which was exercising or enforcing their economic control of the rest of the world, the economic control the U.S. had enjoyed since the end of the Second World War. But with the discussion, it took a long time, almost a decade, before the discussion got real, before the discussion got to be, before many Americans began to understand at all what the U.S. was doing. Now, I think that what the U.S. government was doing in its war policy, and when they did begin to understand it, Americans turned against it. Well, this is the background, I think, to Barack Obama's approach to these matters, he reflects on the experience that he watched as a young man of the U.S. Involvement in Vietnam. You and I, Ron, were involved in a group a couple of years ago that read rather carefully Obama's audition piece for the presidency, a book called The Audacity of Hope. And the analysis of the Vietnam War and the opposition of the Vietnam War in that book is positively prophetic. You can read what Obama has to say about Vietnam, and this book was published, when did it come out? Very early on. I mean,
8 or 9 years ago, yeah.
Oh, more than that, I think, because it was before he, the book was in place by the time he was a senator and was thinking of being a candidate for president. But the notion that the U.S. should not make the same mistakes again in regard to Vietnam was a notion, Obama's notion, that they should not have the same problem explaining what they're doing. Because it was the attempt finally to explain what the U.S. was doing, killing people in Southeast Asia, that led to, according to Obama's account, the U.S. failure in Vietnam. Well, we might argue about that to some extent, because I'd argue that the U.S. in fact, unfortunately, achieved its principal goals in Vietnam. But it was the way in which the war was conducted by the administration that Obama was writing about, that he was thinking about, and that he's applying currently. The best way to maintain the ongoing and indeed wider war that the Obama administration is conducting around the world is to make sure Americans are not talking about it. Because it was when Americans began talking about it in Vietnam in the late 60s that problems for the American government emerged. Now, there are a lot of other things involved. The situations are not exactly parallel by any means, but the fact of the matter is that the administration is consciously making sure that it would not have to face an anti-war movement like the anti-war movement that Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon faced. And the way they're doing it is to lead from behind, as Obama says. That is, get other people, whether it's NATO or the Gulf Cooperation Council, that is Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and so forth, to conduct the wars that the U.S. once conducted in the Middle East, and to use techniques, most notably the drone assassination program, that do not result in heavy American casualties, but do result in killing around the world far beyond any place in which the United States Congress has actually declared war. Now, Obama is conducting this war very effectively in that regard. It seems to me that for all the talk about the difficulties the U.S. is having in conducting war and the complaints that he gets from the American right wing that he's not being vigorous enough in conducting this war, he's in fact being quite successful in doing it. What, after all, is the U.S. trying to do in the Middle East? It's trying to establish a regime, a general setup, a regime, if you like, an overall framework of order, in the phrase attributed to Mrs. Clinton's good friend Henry Kissinger, an overall framework of order in which the U.S. controls the economic life of the Middle East, most notably the passage of energy from the gas and oil resources of that region to the rest of the world. That's what the U.S. has been after. That's what the U.S. has spent 2 generations doing, and it's rather flexible in the ways that it does it. The U.S. government, for the longest time, controlled Mideast energy flows by resting on a tripod of Israel, our offshore, our stationary aircraft carrier in the region, as it's called, Saudi Arabia, the source of the major oil deposits in the Middle East, and Iran, the source of the second major deposit of oil in the Middle East. The U.S. overthrew a government, a democratically elected government in Iran in 1953 in order to install a government it could rely on for this arrangement. There were reversals. In 1979, the Iranians threw out the government that the U.S. had installed and produced a revolutionary government that was no longer willing to do Washington's bidding. Now, American policy ever since then has been a complex attempt, not hesitating to kill a lot of people in the process, to reestablish that structure of control that it had all along. For the most part, it's done it, and it's done it fairly well, and it does it now with a Sunni alliance that includes Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Israel. I know Israel is not a Sunni state, but from the point of view of the American control of the region, they are usable clients. On the other side, they are opposed by a Shia alliance that is primarily Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, and Lebanon, and the attempts to, in spite of all that the U.S. could do, various Iraqi militias. Now, given that lineup, so to speak, those two murderous teams that the U.S. is controlling in the region, the U.S. job has been, the job of the Obama administration, is to make sure that the Shia alliance is in fact under American control, is cooperating with Washington the way the old tripod of Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Israel did. The American deal, Obama's deal with Iran, ostensibly about nuclear weapons, has very little to do with nuclear weapons, largely because the Iranians weren't producing one. But what they did do was reincorporate Iran into this overall framework of order run by the United States, rather grudgingly and only partially, and by no means completely. But nevertheless, Iran is cooperating with Washington again, and the price for that has been the removal of the sanctions placed on Iran by the United States, ostensibly to control nuclear production. Nothing to do with nuclear production. What it has to do with is the whole question of whether the U.S. would control the energy flows from the region. And that brings us full circle, because the primary reason the U.S. wants to control those energy flows is that it's the best weapon they have to use against Russia and China. This has been the elements of American policy from the beginning. Obama is perfectly traditional in this regard. He's following American policy extremely well. And the sort of half-hearted, ignorant, and consciously prevaricating members of the American right who say Obama's not doing enough to defend American interests either don't know how American interests, which means the interests of the American 1%, have been defended for a generation in the Middle East, or they are not willing to recognize that Obama is down with the program, that Obama is doing what's been done all along, and that he's doing it with a fair amount of tactical flexibility, as we see now in Syria. But the process, nevertheless, remains a matter in which the U.S. is responsible for massive death throughout the Middle East, massive displacement of people, and it doesn't matter because the oil flows and the money flows are going the way the American 1% want. So the dogs bark, but the caravan moves on. The McCains of this world complain, but the American government, the Obama administration, continues to follow the policy that the U.S. government has followed for a good long time. And the interesting thing is to see how awareness of this is slowly seeping in even to the Republican Party, the interesting division between Donald Trump and the other Republican candidates, for example.
What remains unclear to me is how the USA got involved in this attempt to bring down the Syrian regime. And where did that come from? I mean, why did this ever become our fight there? That's very obscured.
It's a very good question. And I remember, I think from the beginning, the United States wanted to control, to have complacent and controllable, not complacent, compliant and controllable governments in the Middle East, and it really didn't care too much whether they called themselves Islamic or military or dictatorial or even democratic. You know, Israel makes much about being a democratic state, for example, so long as they do what Washington said. We really don't care that much what government is in Damascus, so long as it obeys orders. Now, what the U.S. saw with the explosion of the Arab Spring and the objection to various oppressive governments in the Middle East was that it could use this popular unrest, these new governments, in order to produce those sorts of compliant states throughout the region. And when such a protest and revolt developed in Syria, the U.S. immediately said, okay, fine, we can use that. We can get the Syrians, you know, who've not always followed orders, although they often did. The U.S. even sent prisoners to Syria to be tortured under the previous administrations. We make the Syrians a little more compliant. Syrians were democratic, and the Syrian government was democratic and popular. Well, you know, make sure that they don't get uppity. Control them a little more, particularly since, in those days, Syria was allied with Iran, and Iran was the bête noire for the United States in the region after the Islamic Revolution. So the U.S. did in Syria exactly what the Carter administration did in Afghanistan 40 years before. It rounded up the most fanatic fighters it could find, which turned out to be Al-Qaeda in many cases, armed them, and sent them into Syria to support this popular revolution. And the result was a civil war in Syria that now seems to be perhaps coming to an end only because the Syrians have have used the assistance of the Russians to defeat this American-encouraged insurgency.
Yeah, well, a lot of it may be motivated by our supposed effort to responsibility to protect and effort to relieve the civilian population of the horrible oppression of the Assad regime.
Yeah.
But this becomes very suspect in view
Exactly.
of what's going on, for example, in Egypt, which is becoming more and more repressive and oppressive, right. And yet there's been no complaint about it because apparently Al-Sisi is very much in line with American policy there, and he's not disturbing Israel. And as long as he continues these policies, American favors will continue, no matter how oppressive he is of the Egyptian population.
The U.S. government is concerned primarily only about one enemy, and that enemy, that potential enemy, is the United States populace. They're the ones that have to be misled. If you can get them asking the wrong questions, you don't have to worry about answers, said Thomas Pynchon, and the Obama administration knows that very well. You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group in the 7th week of 2016. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett, thanks to whom this program and others like it will be available on YouTube. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't, Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Ron Zoke, Michael Bay, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, Karen Arum, David Johnson, David Green, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.